Sanctions for most, waivers for the lucky few. The United States imposing, or rather reimposing, its Iran embargo rules on the rest of the world. Because most trade, in particular oil, involves U.S. dollar transactions, Donald Trump's decision to walk away from the 2015 nuclear agreement forces foreign companies to follow suit. We're going to review the list of 8 nations still allowed to import Iranian crude, which, spoiler alert, do not include most of Washington's EU allies. What response from the likes of France, Germany, and the UK? What's Washington's endgames? U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo appeared to give the game away somewhat last week when he stated that we want to restore democracy there. Beyond the Trump administration's close ties to Israel and Saudi Arabia, why this fixation on Tehran? And what impact will putting the squeeze have on ordinary Iranians and to a regime torn between what you could call pragmatists and hardliners? Today in the France 24 debate, Washington tightens the screws. With us, France's former ambassador to Tehran, François Nicoulot. Welcome back to the show.
Good evening.
A pleasure to welcome from Washington, Behnam Bentaleblu, research fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies think tank. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Great to be with you.
From London, Mohammed Ali Shabani, researcher at the School of African, Asian, and Mideast Studies, SOAS, the editor of Iran Pulse. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
France 24's Sanam Chantier is with us as well. The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. This build-up to the first working day of reimposed sanctions began last Friday with a tweet. Donald Trump parodying Game of Thrones with this tweet, sanctions are coming. Sanam, what was your reaction when you saw this?
I think it's more like, what was the reaction across social media? And I myself tweeted, the man at the helm of the country tweeting with a meme about millions of people who are about to be impacted by these punitive measures, of course, since we've had reactions from various Iranian officials, including Qasem Soleimani, the head of the elite forces, the Al-Quds force. I feel like the rhetoric has taken on a new meaning, François.
Treating this like entertainment?
Of course, that's his background.
Behnam Bentaleblu, is it in poor taste, that kind of a meme?
I must confess that I actually didn't even know that the line came from Game of Thrones. That may tip my hand as to the kind of television shows I may or may not watch. But I didn't think it was necessarily in poor taste. It was previewing the sanctions. We know that Twitter and using the bully pulpit are things that this president and particularly this administration likes to do. Thought it was creative. The Iranians responded in a similarly creative manner. And hopefully this bounds the competition. Over the summer we saw a tweet in all caps and then Iranian responses. As long as people are tweeting and not firing, that's a step in the right direction.
François Nicoulot, there wasn't Twitter when you were the ambassador in Tehran.
Yes. But looking at Trump, as you just said, that reminds me, the famous word of Mark Twain, which was when you only have a hammer to solve problems, all problems take the shape of nails, And it's true, Trump has only one way to solve the problems. In that case, sanctions. Now we will see if it works or not. This is the big question, but we will discuss all of this starting from now.
Let's talk about whether or not Trump has just one tool in his toolbox. 8 countries exempted from importing Iranian oil. Let's list them for you. China, Greece, India, Italy, Turkey, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. Mohammed Ali Shabani, let's cut to the chase here. We're kind of wondering, why Italy and Greece?
Stating that because, for instance, Greek refineries use Iranian oil, which they then process into products which they export to Israel, there are Israeli considerations there. Similarly, we have a similar situation with Italy, again, according to some experts. But I think the bigger picture here is, why are countries like Spain, why are countries like France not exempted from these sanctions? It sends a very peculiar message. And I think this goes back to what the French finance minister said a few months ago, which is France is not going to be a vassal of the United States. And I think the response from the U.S. was seen today.
So for you, this is a punishment of the French, the Germans, and the UK?
I think it's a measure to make sure that they cower and that they do not push back the way other countries have. For instance, you have countries like India, like China, which have flat out said from the get-go, we're not going to comply with these sanctions because they have no UN backing. This is U.S. domestic law that's being kind of ordered around the world, and we're not going to comply with that. I think the French response, the German response initially has always been kind of to say we are allies at a time when the United States is not treating Europe as its own ally. So that kind of approach from Europe, I think, has engendered a response in which you see what's happened today, in which France, a major U.S. ally, is not even exempted from U.S. sanctions. I mean, it's quite bizarre, really.
Ambassador Nicolo, you agree?
Yes, some way. For Italy, perhaps there is also an explanation. Salvini is a great friend of Trump. You know, he's one of the few allies of Trump within the European Union. Perhaps it was a little reward for his friendly position, let's say.
For his friendly position. Let's listen to the U.S. Secretary of State. He spoke alongside his counterpart from the Treasury Department. Mike Pompeo was asked why EU allies didn't make the list.
We've been very candid, clear with all of the European countries. There are more than 3, we should note. Many of them are fully supportive of what it is that we are undertaking. They have taken a different approach with respect to the JCPOA, but it is also something that the whole world should know. European businesses have already made their decisions. They've decided not to do business with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and so we're very confident that the sanctions regime that we're putting in place will be effective.
Salam Chantier.
Unlike what we just heard from Secretary Pompeo, the heat is on the Europeans to make an announcement of some sort when it comes to circumventing these sanctions. They are actually discussing at ministerial level a system that's being referred to as an SPV, which is a special purpose vehicle to somehow safeguard trade.
That's going to raise people's geek factor, but it's very important, this term. Special, what is it, SPV?
SPV, special purpose vehicle, that's being discussed at the moment. But what's peculiar about it is that there doesn't seem to be a deadline in place for the time being. And of course, and this shouldn't come as a surprise, they have hit a number of stumbling blocks, including where to host it and who will participate, because of course there is much fear of reprisals from Washington.
Yeah, the French Public Investment Bank announced with great fanfare in the spring that it was setting up this special fund, and then in September, the boss of announced, look, we're throwing in the towel. This is too complicated to go on our own. To in fact, build up a mechanism where you can still do business while avoid trading in U.S. dollars.
Oh, it's true. It's a complex matter, and the BPI, I mean, this French investment public bank, it's true, made perhaps announce something that they were not able to, in fact, to pursue. It was they realized that they went a bit too fast. In fact, they realized it was too difficult, and it would cut them off from the whole banking community, even not speaking of the United States. So the risk was too big. So they reacted like most important companies in Europe, be it Total, Siemens, Airbus, or of course banks. Banks have been heavily sanctioned, you know, in the last period of sanction between 2010 and 2015, and they're afraid. Even when they could have worked with Iran during the small period of opening after the conclusion of the agreement, they were too frightened to go and work with Iran. And of course, this was a disappointment because it contributed to the fact that the results, I mean, the positive results of the agreement were rather limited.
Behnam Ben Taleblu, you're listening in to the rest of our panel here, and the sense that Donald Trump is punishing a lot of his most faithful allies and rewarding, as you heard the ambassador say a short while earlier, the likes of Italy because they're more like-minded politically.
I actually think that, I'm glad you mentioned this, the data actually doesn't bear this out. If we look at what private tanker tracking firms, such as Tanker Trackers, report for the September 2018 crude oil exports of the Islamic Republic of Iran to the international community, there are only 4 European countries that registered exports. Those 4 are Italy, Greece, Spain, and Croatia. And actually, Spain and Croatia either must have zeroed out, or if they continue transactions, then they would be subject to U.S. sanctions. So it's not like the U.S. has an anti-EU policy when it comes to restricting Iran's exports of crude. It exempted Greece and it exempted Italy. I don't think it's because of like-minded ideological inclination. I think those two countries may have had a bilateral understanding with the United States as to what constitutes a significant reduction and perhaps a target date or schedule to reach said significant reduction. And if we're looking at putting the squeeze on the regime in Tehran, barrels is not the only measure we should be looking at. The measure we should be looking at is dollars. How is Washington attempting to restrict Iran's possession of foreign exchange? And in jurisdictions where Iran is able to sell limited amounts of oil, like the 8 countries that received exemptions, those countries have to open up banks pursuant to the U.S. sanctions that will basically lock up those funds, resurrecting the escrow accounts that existed in 2013, therefore restricting Iran's access to capital. So I think the picture is a little bit more complicated than the ideological inclinations of who is in what capital in Europe versus Washington.
Well, Behnam, let me ask you, French business daily Les Echos, in a piece entitled The Nightmare of French Companies, goes through some of the decisions that especially small and medium-sized businesses have had to go through, but also major corporations like French energy giant Total. The piece quotes one unnamed executive as saying that they had a visit from the CIA to check and make sure that the sanctions are being enforced. What do you say to French business leaders who feel like they're being blackmailed?
Well, I don't know if it's blackmail because there is an entire overt campaign of pressure from Washington. And this pressure campaign is, you could call it, arm twisting and hand holding. So what's been going on since the U.S. left the nuclear deal on May 8th, 2018, is that there's been State Department and Treasury Department roadshows where they meet with foreign banks, business leaders, and they inform them of the risks of doing business with Iran as well as the risks of secondary sanctions. So yes, it is coercive, but it's still speaking to someone who is a partner. And you're trying to come to some kind of common consensus on how to reduce imports from said target country. And in this case, that target country is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And there is space for a broader understanding of, what can a transatlantic policy that's not nuclear related look like on Iran. The French, the Germans, others have hesitations about Iran's human rights record, terrorism, the Syrian theater, ballistic missiles. Yet the JCPOA and the resurrection of the JCPOA sanctions has somehow been this 800-pound gorilla in the room, both during the Obama administration and Trump administration. And that's permitted the likes of Rouhani to signal that there is a much more divided West than ever before.
The JCPOA, just to remind our viewers once again, Sanam Shantier, you covered it. That's the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And at the time, people were making this exact point, that yes, there is this deal when it comes to curbing Tehran's atomic ambitions, but what about all the rest?
Also, I don't necessarily agree with this assessment, and I could be wrong, that this maximum pressure campaign is going to bring the Iranians back to the negotiating table at a time when they were seen by the international community as complying to the terms of the accord. I believe it was 12 times that was confirmed by the international body, the IAEA. Also, according to a report published by the Crisis Group, there's no to little correlation between Iran's economy and its region or its foreign policy. There's also this other school of thought, another argument, that now Iran's going to react to this in a negative way and resume its nuclear program. Again, I could be wrong, but I don't see that as an accurate assessment because, frankly, up until this point, they've had a number of opportunities to pursue this kind of aggressive behavior. Back in May, when Trump initially unraveled the deal, back in August, when the first round of sanctions were imposed, and of course now. And we're just not seeing this. We're seeing, certainly from the outside, that the Iranians continue to work with their European partners to salvage what is being referred to as the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal.
So, Mohammed Ali Shabani, what do you do if you're a leader in Paris, Berlin, or where you are in London, in terms of trying to do business with Iran while avoiding the almighty U.S. dollar and you're having your companies be sanctioned?
Well, before responding to your excellent question, I think your other guest stated that he doesn't believe that there are any ideological considerations behind not granting waivers to countries like, for instance, Spain, citing the lack of any imports of Iranian oil during September. But similarly, for instance, countries like Japan and South Korea, they did not import any Iranian oil in October. Specifically, South Korea completely cut its imports of something called the condensate, which is a product coming from natural gas fields in southern Iran. And in those cases, these countries did receive waivers. So it seems to me that what's at stake right now is the Trump administration is seeing the European Union as an entity, as a rival on the international stage, as an entity able and willing to block its policy towards Iran, and as a result adopting a quite hostile approach towards it. I think right now what we've been hearing about are some reports about side deals having been cut with the Greek and the Italian government without the EU even being informed about these. I think that's quite remarkable, and it's quite alarming if I was a European leader, that the US president, instead of going through the right channels, talking to the EU as a united bloc, is talking to specific members of the bloc to try to stir things up within the union. I think that is quite concerning to me if I was a European leader. Now, what do I think the European Union should do? I think it should be united. It should act in unison. I don't think it's very useful for Europe as a united entity to deal separately as 27 different countries with the United States, because it's not going to get a good
Is
deal
it
that way.
feasible? Can they build this, what they call this special purpose vehicle, this mechanism by which companies can continue to do business with Iran without violating U.S. sanctions or running afoul of U.S. law?
The truth of the matter is that the U.S. can sanction anything it wants. The question is not what the U.S. can sanction. The U.S. can sanction the SPV. The U.S. can sanction the directors of the SPV. It can sanction the hosts of the SPV. It can sanction anyone working with the SPV. The issue is not the U.S. sanctioning or not. The issue is how to respond to those sanctions. Now, we previously spoke about the sanctions being effective, citing Secretary Pompeo here. The question is, what do you mean by efficiency? Is the aim here to instill pain on the Iranian economy? Then yes, they are effective. But if the aim here is to change Iranian policy, they are not effective at all. Rather, I think, rather than the case being that Iran responds to pressure, I think what we see with these waivers is that Trump responds to pressure. Whenever there's any pushback against these policies, he bends. And we've seen these from countries like India, for instance. Now, even though India has not joined the SPV and has so far not announced any intention to do so, it set up rupee accounts for Iran. It continues to import hundreds of thousands of Iranian barrels of oil, and is paying in local currency. No problems whatsoever. I think Europe, if it has a political will to act in its own interest and to act as a sovereign entity that is not subject to U.S. domestic law, it can do so. But there needs to be a will. There needs to be a political will to do so. And right now, I'm not sure if it exists.
All right, what's the political will? What's the end game when it comes to these sanctions? We're going to pick up on those points when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and it's the first full working day since the U.S. reimposed sanctions on Iran, the United States, which has walked away from the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement. We're talking about it with France's former ambassador to Tehran, François Nicolas, who was there at the outset when this deal began to get off the ground.
It's true, long time ago, yes.
Let's give the date. What year was it?
It was in 2003, the first contact between the three Europeans, Germany, Great Britain and France, the first contact, collective contact with Iranian and with Rouhani at the time, precisely, who was the main negotiator and is now President of the Republic.
President of the Republic of Iran. With us from Washington, Behnam Bentaleblu, Research Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Welcome back as well to Mohammed Ali Shabani, who joins us from London, researcher at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and is also the editor of Iran Pulse. France 24's Sanam Chantier, you could say, was there for the other end of this Iran deal, covering those crunch negotiations that took place mostly in Geneva and Vienna. Before the break, we were talking about asking the question of what is the end game. Last week, Mike Pompeo talked of bringing democracy to Iran. Here's how the Israeli Prime Minister put what he describes as a historic decision.
I would like again to thank US President Donald Trump for a courageous, determined and important decision. I think that this matter contributes to stability, security and peace. It is true that there could yet be bumps on the road, but this must be approached from a very forthright and steadfast position, morally, economically, and security-wise.
There could be bumps on the road, but this is going to bring more stability and security to the region. Ben Taliblu, you agree with that?
I think if there's a genuine maximum pressure campaign, it's going to need to have a regional approach. I think in October of 2017, when the president laid out his more comprehensive Iran policy, the first leg of that policy involved pushing back on Iran in the region. And unfortunately, you haven't seen that in earnest. You've actually seen a bit of a retreat. As Iranian use of ballistic missiles steps up in the region, in less than 1.5 years, we've had 19 operational uses, or 19 Iranian ballistic missiles fired in military operations. That's changing a new norm in the Middle East. And you've had ballistic missile defenses removed from actually the Persian Gulf. So in some ways, the U.S. may be sending the wrong signals about pushing back on Iran in the region. And if it wants a genuine pressure policy to get stability and security, like the Prime Minister said, some of the regional elements really need to be stepped up before that can change Tehran's calculus.
And regarding Mike Pompeo's comment about bringing democracy there, is this about regime change?
No, I don't necessarily see it that way. And I think for every comment that you have about bringing democracy, there's also several other comments about the goal being behavior change. I think if the goal was regime change, those 12-ish points that the secretary had mentioned would have actually dealt with how the Iranian government conducts itself at home. I think the bulk of those 12 points, if I'm not mistaken, deal with Iran's foreign and security policy. So this seems to be a very coercive, very aggressive behavior change strategy. It is high risk, high reward, because the way the U.S. withdrew from the deal, the UN resolution endorsing it is still in effect. Some of its greatest partners are not supportive of this coercive strategy, even though they claim to see the threats the same way, whether it's ballistic missiles, Syria, human rights, whatnot. So it is going to be a challenging road, but I think it's a tough behavior change strategy at the moment.
Mohammed Ali Shabani?
Well, I think Pompeo, he said he wants to restore democracy to Iran. Now, we had democracy in Iran in 1953. And what happened then was that the U.S. came in with the UK and they instigated a coup and they removed the democratically elected prime minister. And they imposed 26 years of, an authoritarian rule under the Shah, who was their ally. So I don't know what precisely he's referring to, 1953, or is his idea of democracy being ruled by the Shah? I'm a bit confused about that. When we talk about the impact of his policies, of Trump's policies on security and stability in the region, Iran is a country of 80 million. It borders in over a dozen countries. It's played crucial roles in stabilizing Iraq and to lesser extent Syria. In Iraq, we've seen it step in and prevent the onslaught of ISIS. And when my counterpart were talking about ballistic missile launches, it's true that Iran has engaged in such. But every single time it's launched any attacks in the past 18 months, the actual target has been ISIS. Iran has not attacked any American forces, any Israeli forces, any Saudi forces, any Emirati forces. Every single time he launched a ballistic missile attack has been on ISIS. I'm not sure whether that would be something that the U.S. would object to. So that seems a little bit strange to me in my own analysis. As for security and stability in the region, I just don't see how trying to actively destabilize a country of 80 million, bordering Iraq, bordering Afghanistan, is going to aid security in the region. Rather, I think it'll have the opposite effect. So far, I don't see any signs of Iran being destabilized, but I think looking at the demands of Pompeo, the 13th demand, and the 13th one actually pertains to Iran's domestic politics. He added a 13th demand saying that Iran has to also address its human rights situation at home. So I think when you have 13 priorities, you really have none. If you have a policy objective, usually put forth 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 specific points, but this is just so broad, so fundamental that essentially what they're telling Iran is you need to abandon your foreign policy and also change the way you conduct your governance at home, which I actually agree with. I think the human rights situation in Iran is terrible, and they need to work on that. But I see the amount of demands and the way it's presented. The only thing it really reminds me of is the 13 demands that Saudi Arabia and the UAE imposed on Qatar in 2017, and telling Qatar, change all of this, or we're going to sanction you and blockade you. It's just very eerie, the 13 demands by each side.
François Nicolot, in the build-up to the signing of the 2015 deal, the French, among the toughest on Tehran, among the most hawkish, at one point even more hawkish than the U.S. during that negotiating process. What's France's stance going to be going forward now?
No, to come back to this period, in fact, I mean, I think on the public scene, it's true. France looked hawkish, but I remember there was a confidence made by one of the Iranian negotiators saying, but in fact, in private and during the discussion, we had no problem with a friend. They were quite nice. So it was a bit of a show. And it didn't...
It was grandstanding.
Yes, it did not leave scars or anything. At the present moment, I mean, Macron, certainly President Macron has chosen another line, tried to stay, the famous at the same time, this is part of
on the one hand this, on the other hand that.
Yes, on one hand, I mean, to stay a friend with the United States, and on the other hand, try to find a solution with Iran. It's for the moment it does not work. Obviously, the gap is too wide really to reconcile the two sides. We'll see. Now we have to wait. New circumstances. We have to see. The big question is, I mean, everybody is wondering. I mean, will Iran resist? I mean, and of course, I mean, this regime, fortunately or unfortunately, I'll let you choose. Is quite resilient. It's not. It's not North Korea. It's not the rule of one person. It's the rule of a community. You have the brain, not only the leader, the supreme leader, but the clergy around an important part of the clergy around him, and you have a very strong backbone, which is of course the Pasdaran, the IRGC. This elite army, which have a very strong footprint in military affairs, in Syria, in Iraq, and of course in economics, in politics, and they are loyal to the regime. People say that perhaps there will be a military coup. I don't think this is realistic.
Because we did see those protests against working conditions back in a few months back, yes, with cries telling the regime, why are we so much involved in Syria?
It's true, but the regime, I mean, the clergy, the Pasdaran, I mean, and the supporters represent probably 15% of the population, not much more. But it's enough to hold the country. The regime won't hesitate to crush any kind of protest. It has shown it in the past, and it will do it in the future.
François Nicolot asking how ordinary Iranians, are going to weather this return of sanctions. Many businesses grappling with the same challenges as their partners in Europe they've been doing business with. Reza Sayeh reports from Tehran.
Entrepreneur Navid Aghdam has 4 minutes to go on stage and convince 5 judges that his business venture is Iran's next best high-tech startup.
Hello, everyone.
With no time to waste,
all of you have enjoyed Iranian watermelon taste.
Aghdam uses a watermelon to help prove his point.
Thank God it worked. The judges even suggested that I give them the watermelon, but I said no.
Please give a round of applause.
Aghdam is among dozens of entrepreneurs taking part in Silk Road Startup, a nationwide competition to choose Iran's next best startup company. Aghdam's startup is Corridors, an online service that makes it easier and cheaper for merchants to ship goods via Iran's railway system. The startup competition comes amid new U.S. sanctions that cut off the foreign investment Iran's economy was hoping for when it signed the nuclear deal with world powers in 2015.
We just have to find a new way to fight back,
Hamed Jafari and Mohammad Reza Azali are 2 of the co-founders of Silk Road Startup. They say their competition shows Iran's highly educated and ambitious high-tech scene is still an attractive market that's not backing down to U.S. sanctions.
I mean, it's a gold mine. It's the last untapped emerging market.
Other countries can see the potential. If the European Union or Russia or China, we can make a deal with them. It's a U.S. loss.
The future of Iran's high-tech scene could feature Aghdam's Corridors, His startup came in first place, after which he credited his team and his watermelon.
So, Sanctions, those entrepreneurs putting positive spin on what's to lie ahead. What have you found doing a bit of digging?
Also, despite reassurances from the US administration that these punitive measures will only impact the government, we know that the average Iranian is going to be hit hard. I'm going to break this down for you because, of course, officially, according to OFAC, that's a government agency in the United States, humanitarian supplies are exempted, they're off the table. However, we have been here before. We know that foreign companies and banks are terrified of doing transactions with the Iranians, even if that includes medical supplies, because of the repercussions from the United States. And of course, penalties like this are not unprecedented. Now, I've spent the day, in fact, last week, speaking to Iranians in the country, and I'm hearing, for example, from a driver, and this is something that you hear from across the board, on the one hand saying, I'm scared that I won't be able to put food on the table tomorrow because we have seen an extreme rise in food supplies. There's, of course, the drop in the currency, the rial, which again has hit an all-time low. But in addition to that, I hold my government accountable for this because there's an immense deal of corruption. Now, going back to the medical supplies that I just mentioned, I spoke to a manager of a private pharmaceutical company, and he said that inside Iran, 60 to 7% of medicines are actually domestically produced. The rest is imported. And a part of that is something that's referred to as orphan drugs. These are drugs used to treat rather rare diseases. And he said, I've put my order in, but there's no way as a result of these sanctions that I'll be able to pay for them. But he added that there's also a bone to be picked with the Ministry of Health. There has been immense mismanagement. He said to me, we knew this was going to happen. Why is it that we're not prepared today? So this assessment that the average Iranian is not going to be impacted by the sanctions is wholly inaccurate. Couple that with the fact that people are complaining about mismanagement and corruption. And in fact, it is more so the average Iranian that is getting hit by these than government officials, which is what apparently the US administration is intending to do.
Ben Taleblu, you hear that? The impact isn't going to be on the Republican Guards, it's going to be on ordinary citizens.
Well, the ordinary citizens, no one has actually repressed them more, no one has actually impeded the genuine Iranian private sector more than IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, banks, businesses, and small and medium enterprises. A good example is the Tehran Bazaar. The Grand Bazaar, which helped propel socially and economically the Islamic Revolution into power, is now a shadow of its former self. It doesn't have that political, economic clout that it used to. That's not a product of sanctions. That's a product of mismanagement. I think if Sanam's two very important anecdotes, two very telling human anecdotes tell us anything, is that the regime has constantly prioritized other things as opposed to the welfare of their own people, which is why the Iranians rightly castigated the regime. And in fact, when members of Tehran's Bazaar protested earlier in the summer, they were saying that we know our enemy is not over there, meaning in America, our enemy is here. And they were saying that standing outside of the parliament. These kind of calls are quite telling. And just a line on the humanitarian transactions, if I might. Yes, the Treasury Department keeps that line open, but it's, again, the regime in Tehran that is abusing the line, which will make the banks be more risk-averse. Key example, the 2012 sanctions-busting crisis with Turkey and gas for gold. So Turkey, which received exemptions and waivers under the Obama administration, was permitted to create bank accounts so that they could facilitate payments to Iran for gas and oil. However, Iran abused that system, and as opposed to buying local goods that are humanitarian goods that Iran can buy and ship into the country, it chose to buy gold, send that through Dubai, turn it into cash, and give the regime cash on hand so it could continue engaging in
But again, it's ordinary citizens. It's ordinary citizens being hit harder than the high ups.
Well, the high ups have been the ranking. Like today, what a day to actually mention that, because today, there are 700 entities that have been restored to the specially designated nationals list. These are not your average Iranians. These are people who have businesses that are owned or controlled by veterans or members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This is how Iran hides its wealth. No one is saying that sanctions are a perfect policy. No one is saying that they're even a silver bullet. But this is the most peaceful yet coercive policy you can take. If your goal is to impede the revenue that the IRGC and the regime has on hand, what other coercive policy tools are there? And in this chasm of silence, where people have critiqued sanctions but never offered up another coercive policy tool to restrict and constrain Tehran, this is the best way ahead.
Mohammed Ali Shabani?
You know, we keep hearing a lot of arguments in favor of saying that the Iranian, government is spending the revenue it could use for people at home abroad, and that's the reason for the malaise at home. All the other money for the economy is somehow escaping the country, being spent abroad. I think let's look at the figures. The United States and Israel, two countries which have no interest whatsoever in understating Iran's spending abroad, especially since it's a key talking point right now. They claim that Iran has spent since 2011, since the outbreak of the war in Syria, $12 billion. That constitutes $1.7 billion a year, or $140 million a month. Saudi Arabia spends $5 billion a month in Yemen. That's 35 times what Iran spends in Syria. $1.7 billion a year in Iran is 0.4% of GDP. It's not even 1% of the economy. Now, let me give you another figure. Every year in Iran, because of the currency exchange rate, which has happened, the devaluation which has happened, and the reinstitution of multiple tiers, the corruption emanating from that is estimated at $30 billion a year, 15 times what Iran is spending in Syria. And where does corruption come from? It comes from a situation where the private sector is weakened. It comes from a situation where the black market reemerges, when smuggling reemerges. This all happens when you have collective and indiscriminate punishment of the Iranian people, when you restrict legal and lawful trade and you force it into the gray zone or the dark zones. You have corruption, you have all of this kind of waste coming in. And basically, I think the situation right now, when you're looking at it, it's nothing short of outright collective punishment. And I think it's not like something that has to be debated or hasn't been really established. We had the exact same set of sanctions just a few years ago. And just there's one study from 2013, strangely, coincidentally, authored by an Iranian Iranian-American dual national who's currently in prison in Evin in Tehran, jailed by the IRGC, the very forces which are going to be empowered by these sanctions. And he argued that because of the sanctions instituted by Obama, there's been a 30% drop in exports of medicine and medical devices by Europe and the United States. So the impact of these kinds of sanctions on the Iranian people in terms of the amount of medicine and medical equipment that's been exported, the way they promote the IRGC, the way they promote smuggling, all of that I think is well established.
Proliferation of the black market, Ambassador Nikoro. You mentioned how the inner circle has a critical mass that's large enough in Iran so that they can weather the storm at the top.
Yes, obviously. The end result will be that the vast majority of the people will get poorer, but there will be a happy few who will become much, much, much richer. This is what happened before. It happened exactly the same way in the harshest period of sanctions between 2012 and 2015, and this will reproduce, obviously.
And as always, there's this tug of war, right, between the pragmatists and those who are more hard line.
Yes, probably. That's true. The hardliners will be empowered by the new situation. But at the end of the day, we come back to the same question. Will this sanction be able to destabilize this regime, to create a regime change? Historically, there are very few situations in which sanctions, only sanctions, without war, without other measures, have produced a regime change. It happened probably in northern Rhodesia, in the 60s, 70s. It happened probably in South Africa. But these were really specific situations. In other cases, and with countries much weaker and smaller than Iran, in fact, sanctions had to be complemented by a military intervention. That was true in Dominican Republic, that was true with Panama, and you can find many other examples in history.
I want to ask you, Mohammed Ali Shabani, last Thursday, In the midst of all of this, Norway summoned the Iranian ambassador over a suspected assassination plot against an Iranian Arab opposition figure in Denmark. A Norwegian citizen of Iranian background arrested in Sweden on October 21st, extradited to Denmark. The attack allegedly meaning to target the leader of the Danish branch of something called the Arab Struggle Movement for the Liberation of Avaz, which wants a separate state for ethnic Arabs in Iran's oil-producing southwestern province of Khuzestan. Now, you have this instance, plus there was this foiled plot, it seems, here in Paris, that meeting of that opposition group that takes place every year outside of Paris. Is the regime already becoming more aggressive?
Well, the Iranians are denying both of those claims. Now, if you take that with a grain of salt and you say, okay, Iran was involved, you have to look at who in Iran was involved and why. These kinds of plots, they come at the worst possible time for Iran-EU engagement. So the argument goes back to who would benefit from the Iranian economy being closed, from the re-emergence of the black market, from the increase in smuggling, from the increase in corruption because they control those kinds of sectors. It goes back to the hardline forces which rejected or was always opposed to the JCPOA in the first place. So I think what we're seeing as a result of the pressure on Iran, if these plots genuinely are a result of the involvement of rogue operations in Iran, based in Tehran, we're just seeing the empowering of hardliners in Tehran. That's the only effect of sanctions so far.
So
even the United States, even Secretary Pompeo himself has said so far he has seen no indication of any change in Iranian government policy whatsoever.
You agree with that assessment, Salam, that we're witnessing some kind of palace intrigue between hardliners and more
what we're
moderate?
hearing from a lot of observers is they tend to be questioning the timing of this. As Mohammad Ali Shahbani just said, this is coming at a time when Iran and European powers are trying to salvage the deal. It almost seems like an own goal, one observer said to me earlier, especially against a group like the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, a former terrorist organization, a cult-like group that actually hold annual rallies in France. So it does beg the question, why now?
Why now, indeed. Benam Ben Taliblu, the empowering of hardliners?
No, not necessarily, but it is important to note that there is a factional fight going on right now. While many believe that over the summer, because Qasem Soleimani came to President Rouhani's defense in response to the all caps tweet by President Trump, that pressure from abroad is uniting Iran's fractious factions. One needs to only look at the covers of Iranian newspapers throughout the month of October to see that you have a constant drumbeat of IRGC officials, former military veterans, critiquing the Rouhani administration, saying that if this administration can't do it, they need to step aside. This is politics 101. The old saying goes, wherever there is people, there is politics. The problem is, whether it's one faction or another, both of them are working to further the ideological and strategic interests of the Islamic Republic, which remain fundamentally at odds, with U.S. security interests and values in the Middle East. So this gets you to the point of why do you need a coercive U.S. policy towards Tehran? It's because what Iran does abroad ideologically and strategically is against those larger U.S. goals. So regardless of some of that factional jockeying, you've seen Rouhani condemn ballistic missile tests in debates in his election bid in 2017, only months later to praise them. And then only just a month ago during Iran-Iraq war rallies, Rouhani again said that the ballistic missiles are the best weapon Iran has. So even those who will get painted as a moderate have actually a quite flexible identity over time. That's because they're all working as part of this larger service to better the Islamic Republic and to keep that regime alive.
Ambassador Nicolou, we're almost out of time. Just a quick final question on this.
Yes.
Is this history repeating itself, the return to the regime of sanctions?
That what would happen to the regime? That it could...
No, the sanctions regime. Is this history repeating itself? Does it feel like that to you?
It is repeating itself with a big difference this time is that the United States are alone. I mean, a big country. Being alone perhaps is not too much of a problem for them, but still, in the long run, the legitimacy of the sanctions, the legitimacy of this kind of policy, the fact that Europe in fact, that Europe, shifts away from this line. It's a bonus. It's a bounty for the Iranians. The Iranians have always tried to create a rift between the Americans and the Europeans. That was their dream, and up to now they failed miserably. But at long last, they have a chance to create this rift, and this is what we see under our eyes at the present moment.
François Nicolas, we'll leave it there. I want to thank you. I want to thank Behnam Ben Taleblu for joining us from Washington, Mohammed Al-Shabani in London, Sanam Chantier, thank you for being with us here in the France 24.